There's a kind of man the world forgets about. He does not trend on social media. He does not own anything worth photographing. He wakes before sunrise not because of ambition, but because the forest does not wait, and neither does hunger. The world walks past men like Cole Rivers every single day and sees nothing worth stopping for. But on the night of September 14th, in the cold shadow of the Montana Rockies, the world's most powerful father got down on his knees in the mud and begged a forgotten man for the one thing money had never failed to buy him. And Cole looked at him and said nothing. He simply turned around and walked back into the dark. What happened in those 12 hours before that moment will change how you see wealth, dignity, and what a human being is truly worth. Stay with this story until the very end, because the final scene will hit you in a place you did not know was still open. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories here that remind you what people are actually capable of. Drop a thumbs up if you believe quiet people carry the loudest strength. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that goodness still exists in this world. And before we dive in, drop your country or city in the comments below. We want to know where in the world our family is watching from tonight. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Cole Rivers was 38 years old and already looked 50, not because life had been cruel exactly, but because it had been honest. Every line on his face was earned. Every callus on his hands told a story that no resume could hold. He lived alone in a cabin 12 miles outside of Darby, Montana, a structure his grandfather had built with timber cut from the very land it stood on. The roof leaked in 2 places. The floorboard spoke when you walked across them at night. The heating system was a wood stove that Cole fed every morning the same way he fed himself. Carefully, and with full awareness that there was no backup plan. He had not always been alone. 2 years before the story begins, his wife Margaret had sat in a hospital chair and held his hand and told him she was tired. She was 34. The cancer had moved fast. Cole had sold his truck to cover the last round of treatment. It had not worked. After the funeral, he drove her sister's car back to the cabin, sat on the porch until the stars came out, and then went inside and did not speak to another human being for 11 days. When he finally walked back into town to buy flour and salt, Mrs. Paulson at the general store had looked at him and quietly slid an extra bag of dried beans across the counter, without a word. He had nodded. That was Montana. The grief he carried from Margaret had a twin that almost nobody knew about. 3 years before her death, Margaret had been pregnant. They had painted the small back room a pale yellow. Cole had carved a small wooden rabbit and set it on the windowsill. At 22 weeks, the pregnancy ended without warning. The yellow room stayed yellow because neither of them could bring themselves to change it. Cole never spoke about it, but sometimes when he was deep in the forest alone, tracking something through the undergrowth, he would stop and listen and feel the specific wave of silence that had a shape to it, the shape of everything that never got to arrive. He owed $40,000 in back property taxes. The county had sent 3 notices. The last one had a date circled in red, November 1st. After that, the land went to auction. Cole had read that letter 4 times, folded it precisely, and placed it under the wooden rabbit in the yellow room. Then he had gone out to check his traps because there was nothing else useful to do. That was the man who walked into the forest before dawn on September 14th. 600 miles away, in a glass office above downtown Chicago, Richard Vail was ending a phone call that had just made him $40 million richer. He did not celebrate. He simply uncapped his pen, initialed 3 pages, and handed them to his assistant without looking up. That was how Richard operated. Victory was not something you savored. It was something you processed and moved past. Sentiment was inefficiency dressed in nicer clothes. Richard Vail had built his logistics empire from a single delivery van he drove himself at 22. He had slept in that van twice during his first winter because the apartment deposit wiped out his remaining cash. Nobody who worked for him now knew that story. He had buried it deliberately, the way you bury something not out of shame, but out of strategy. Weakness, even historical weakness, was information your enemies could use. Richard did not hand people weapons. He was 54 years old, trim, silver the temples, and carried himself with particular stillness of someone who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. He had been married once, His ex-wife Sandra had lasted 6 years before telling him quietly over dinner that she felt like a department in his company rather than a person in his life. He had not argued because arguing required believing she was wrong. She had taken a fair settlement and moved to Portland. He had restructured his schedule by the following Monday. The one place Richard Vale's control system had a gap was a 7-year-old girl named Lily. She had Sandra's eyes and Richard's stubbornness in a laugh that arrived without warning and filled every room it entered. She spent alternate weekends with Richard under a custody arrangement that his lawyers had negotiated with the same precision they applied to everything else. But Lily did not operate on legal frameworks. She operated on pure feeling, and somehow, inexplicably, she had decided that her father was worth loving without reservation. Richard did not fully understand this. He accepted it the way a man accepts sunlight, without knowing how to explain it, but aware that something inside him needed it to survive. On the morning of September 13th, Richard had flown Lily from Chicago to Montana for what his calendar described as a recreational weekend. He had blocked 48 hours. 48 hours was what he could offer. Lily had packed a backpack with a stuffed bear, 3 granola bars, and a field guide to North American birds that she had checked out from her school library. She had shown it to Richard on the plane. He had glanced at it and said it looked interesting. She had looked out the window, and he had gone back to his emails, and neither of them had spoken again until landing. The helicopter was a charter. It seated 6. It lifted them from the regional airfield and swung northwest toward the mountain range, where Richard had booked 2 nights at a private lodge that cost more per night than Coal Rivers owed in total taxes. They were 40 minutes from landing when the hydraulic warning light blinked on. The pilot's voice shifted in a way that Richard recognized immediately as controlled alarm, the tone professionals use when they are afraid but cannot afford to show it fully. They were going down, not crashing. Descending fast in a controlled emergency landing in a meadow clearing 2 miles from the nearest road. The landing was hard but clean. Everyone walked away. The pilot radioed for a ground crew. Richard stepped out into the cold mountain air, phone already at his ear, rebuilding the logistics of the day in real time. He told Lily to stay close to the helicopter. She said she would. He believed her because he needed to, and because he had a problem to solve, and because he was Richard Vale and problems were what he was designed for. He was on the phone for 11 minutes. When he turned around, Lily was gone. The stuffed bear was still on the seat. The field guide to North American birds lay open on the grass, its pages lifting softly in the mountain wind. Richard stood very still for 3 full seconds, something no one who worked with him had ever witnessed. Then he called her name once, twice, a third time, each repetition slightly louder than the last, until he was standing in an open meadow in the Montana Rockies, shouting his daughter's name at tree line that gave him nothing back but echo. The pilot called search and rescue within the hour. 2 teams arrived before dark. They were experienced, well-equipped, and methodical. They swept the eastern tree line first, then the northern ridge trail, communicating in short bursts of radio static that Richard listened to from the meadow with his jacket still on, his tie still straight, as if maintaining his appearance was the last form of control available to him. By 9 in the evening, both teams had pulled back to reassess. The lead coordinator, a woman named Hayes, approached Richard carefully. She told him the terrain beyond the northern ridge was steep and heavily forested. Visibility at night was near zero. Continuing in the dark risked the safety of her team. They would resume at first light with additional support, dogs, and a drone unit. She said the words calmly and professionally and watched Richard Vale's face as she said them. His jaw tightened once. That was all. He nodded. He thanked her. He sat down on the cold ground in his expensive suit and did not move for a very long time. Somewhere beyond that dark tree line, his daughter was alone, and for the first time in 30 years, Richard Vale had absolutely nothing to offer. Cole had been tracking a wounded deer for 2 hours when he found the footprints. He almost missed them. They were small, pressed lightly into a soft patch of mud beside a narrow creek, partially filled with water already from the cold ground seeping upward. He crouched down and brought his lantern close without touching the earth around them. A child, barefoot in one spot, where a boot had slipped off briefly, then been put back on, moving northeast, which meant moving deeper into the ridge, away from any road, away from any warmth, toward the kind of terrain that swallowed grown men who did not know it. Cole sat back on his heels and looked into the darkness ahead. He was not a man who overthought things. Overthinking was a luxury that required spare time and a safety net. Two things he had never owned simultaneously. He thought in straight lines. There was a child in these woods. The temperature was dropping toward 28 degrees. He was the only person within range who knew this particular stretch of forest well enough to move through it at night without dying. That was the entire calculation. He picked up his lantern, left a wounded deer to forest, and followed the footprints north. The trees thickened fast beyond the creek. Spruce and lodgepole pine, so dense the lantern light, barely reached the ground 5 feet ahead. Cole moved the way he always moved in deep cover. Slowly, weighed on the outer edge of each foot, reading the ground before trusting it. He listened between each step. The forest at night is not silent. It breathes and shifts and speaks in frequencies that most people are too distracted to hear. Cole had been listening to it since he was 9 years old. He knew the difference between a branch dropping from cold contraction and a branch breaking under weight. He knew which sounds belonged and which ones were interruptions. 40 minutes in, he heard something that did not belong. It was faint, carried on a gust that pushed through a gap in the canopy above him. A voice, small, not crying, something steadier than crying. He stopped completely and waited for the wind to return. It came again. A child's voice, thin and clear, singing something without recognizable words. The sound of a child entertaining herself in the dark because the alternative was being afraid, and she had apparently decided against fear. Something moved in Cole's chest that he did not have a name for. He turned toward the sound and kept walking. He found her 12 minutes later. Lilyvale was curled at the base of a fallen oak, its massive upended root system forming a rough wall behind her that had blocked the worst of the wind. She had taken off her outer jacket and wrapped it around her legs, leaving her small arms exposed in a thin, long-sleeved shirt. Her boots were still on. She had gathered a small pile of dry bark beside her, not enough for a fire, but gathered with the instinct of a child who understood that doing something was better than doing nothing. She was singing softly to a pine cone she held in both hands, turning it slowly, examining in the dark by feel alone. Cole stepped into the small clearing and stopped. Lily looked up. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She looked at him with the direct, measuring gaze of a child who has been alone long enough that a stranger feels like relief rather than danger. Her face was dirty. Her lips were pale from cold, but her eyes were steady. She said, "I knew someone would come. I asked the forest." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he set down his pack, pulled out the heavy wool blanket he carried for overnight hunts, and crossed the space between them. He wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. She let him. She leaned into the warmth immediately the way children do, without pretense, without pride, the body simply taking what it needs. He gave her his water first. She drank half without stopping. He opened a cloth pouch and handed her a strip of dried venison. She ate it. He gave her a second piece. She ate that too. Then she looked up at him and said, "Are you a ranger?" He said, "No." She said, "Then what are you?" He thought about it for a second longer than the question probably required. "Just someone who was nearby," he said. She nodded as if this was a perfectly complete answer. Cole checked her hands and face for frostbite. Her fingertips were cold, but the color returned with pressure. Her ears were covered by a fleece headband she had pulled from her jacket pocket. She was cold and tired and hungry, but she was intact. The forest had been rough with her, but not merciless. He calculated 7 miles back to the meadow. Terrain he knew. For hours at a careful pace carrying a child, maybe less if she was light enough that he could move steadily. He looked at her. She was already drowsing against his arm, the wool blanket pulled to her chin, the pine cone still in her hand. He put the pack on his back. He lifted her carefully, one arm under her knees, one behind her back. She made a small sound and settled against his chest without waking fully. He adjusted her weight, picked up the lantern, and turned back south. 7 miles. For hours. 28 degrees and falling. He walked. The forest pushed back the way forests do at night. Roots reaching for his boots, branches dropping cold water down the back of his neck, the ground shifting between frozen crust and soft mud without pattern or warning. Cole felt none of it as inconvenience. This was simply the terrain. You did not argue with terrain. You read it, and you moved, and you kept moving. He talked to Lily quietly when she stirred. Not full sentences, just low sounds of reassurance. The same voice he had once used when injured elk he had tracked for 3 days before deciding not to take the shot. The voice that said, without words, "You're not alone in this, and we are going to be fine." Lily slept most of the way. Once she woke and looked up at the sky through the canopy and said, "There are so many stars." Cole looked up too. There were. He had stopped noticing them years ago, the way you stop noticing anything that is always there. He noticed them now. He did not say anything. He just kept walking. 2 hours in, his left shoulder began to ache from her weight. He switched her carefully to the right side, without breaking stride. His boots were soaked through from a creek crossing where the stepping stones had shifted. The cold worked up from his feet in slow, steady degrees. He was aware of it the way he was aware of everything, as information, not complaint. He thought about Margaret once, briefly, somewhere around the 5th mile. He did not know exactly why. Maybe it was the weight of the child against his chest. Maybe it was the pale yellow color of Lily's jacket sleeve catching the lantern light. He let the thought arrive, and then he let it go. The way you release something into moving water. There was a task in front of him. There would be time for everything else later. There always was, until there wasn't. The tree line broke open at 3:47 in the morning. The meadow appeared ahead, gray and wide under sky, just beginning to soften at its eastern edge. Cole saw the lights first. Portable floodlights set up around the helicopter. 2 vehicles, several figures standing in the cold. Then one figure separated from the rest and began walking fast toward the tree line, then running. Cole stopped at the edge of the trees and waited. Richard Vale had not slept. He had sat on a folding chair someone placed behind him at some point during the night and stared at the tree line without moving for 6 hours. His phone had died at midnight. He had not asked anyone to charge it. The lead coordinator, Hayes, had checked on him twice, offered coffee, offered a blanket. He had declined both without turning his head. One of the rescue team members had quietly told another that in 15 years of search operations, he had never seen a parent sit that still. It was not the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of a man holding himself together by pure force. The way you press both hands against a wound and do not move, because moving means accepting what is happening. Sometime after 2 in the morning, a second coordinator had approached Richard and suggested gently that they resume the conversation about next steps. Richard had looked at him with eyes that stopped the man mid-sentence. There were no next steps. There was only one step. His daughter came out of those trees. Everything else was noise. The assistant Marcus had driven up from the airfield at midnight with charged phone and a change of clothes. Richard had taken the phone, seen 47 missed calls and 219 messages, and set it face down on the ground beside his chair. Marcus stood nearby in silence, doing the only useful thing available to him, which was being present without demanding anything in return. Marcus had worked for Richard for 9 years. He had never seen his employer's hands shake. They were shaking now, very slightly, pressed flat against his knees in the cold. At 3:44 in the morning, one of the team members near the northern edge of the meadow called out. Not a shout, a sharp single word that cut through the quiet. Richard was on his feet before the sound finished. He did not decide to stand. His body simply rose, overriding every other system, the way a body does when it recognizes something the mind is still processing. He saw the lantern first. A single warm point of light at the tree line, steady and unhurried. Then the shape behind it. A man, broad-shouldered, moving out of the dark with something held against his chest. Richard was already walking. Then he was running across wet grass in dress shoes that had no business being in a Montana meadow, his breath coming in hard, visible clouds. The distance between him and that lantern light, shrinking with each stride. Cole stopped at the meadow's edge and watched the man come. He had expected relief on the father's face. He had expected gratitude, the loud, overwhelming kind that people perform when cameras are present or witnesses are watching. What he saw instead stopped him in a way he had not anticipated. Richard Vale's face, as he crossed that final distance, was completely open, every wall down, every defense stripped back to nothing. This was not a billionaire. This was not a man who controlled supply chains across 11 countries. This was a father, raw and undone, running toward his child across a dark field in the middle of the night. An expression he wore was one Cole recognized because he felt its mirror image once, standing in a hospital corridor being told there was nothing more they could do. It was a face of someone discovering exactly how much they have to lose. Richard reached them and stopped 2 feet away. His eyes went to Lily first. She was awake now, blinking slowly against the sudden light, the wool blanket still wrapped around her, the pine cone still in her hand. She looked at her father and said, "Daddy, I found a deer trail. Did you know deer trails always led somewhere?" Richard made a sound that was not a word. He reached for her and Cole transferred her weight carefully, making sure the handoff was secure before releasing his arms. The moment Lily settled against her father's chest, Richard's legs went, not gradually, all at once. He went down onto one knee in the wet grass, both arms locked around his daughter, his face pressed against the top of her head, his shoulders shaking with the specific violence of a man crying who has had no practice at it. Lily patted his back with one small hand. "It's okay, Daddy," she said quietly. The man knew the way. Cole stood and watched this and felt the ache in his shoulder and the cold at his feet, and something else underneath both of those things, something older and quieter that he did not examine directly. He looked at the sky above the meadow. The eastern edge was definitely lighter now. Maybe an hour to sunrise. He thought about the walk back to where he had left his pack before crossing the creek. He thought about the wounded deer, long gone by now. He thought about the wooden rabbit on the windowsill of the yellow room. After a long moment, Richard lifted his face from Lily's hair. His eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to conceal it. He looked at Cole with an expression that carried the full weight of someone who has just been shown the precise limit of their own power and is still processing the geography of that discovery. He stood slowly, Lily held against him, and faced a man who had walked 7 miles through the dark to bring her back. "Name your price," Richard said. His voice was rough. "Anything, whatever you need, whatever you want. Name it, and it's done." Cole looked at him for a moment. The floodlights hummed behind them. Somewhere in the team a radio crackled. The grass was cold and wet, and the sky was turning the specific dark blue that comes just before the first gray light of morning. "She is not mine to sell back to you," Cole said. Then he picked up his lantern, turned, and walked back toward the tree line. Richard stood in the meadow and watched him go. He opened his mouth once and closed it. Lily had fallen asleep again against his shoulder, her breath slow and even, the pine cone still loosely held in her small fist. Marcus appeared at Richard's side and said nothing. The coordinator Hayes stood a few feet away with her clipboard lowered, watching the lantern light move back into the trees and grow smaller and then disappear entirely. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then Richard said quietly, to no one in particular, "Find out who he is." Marcus was already writing. Marcus Held had been Richard Vale's assistant for 9 years, and in that time he had sourced a private island for a weekend, negotiated a dinner reservation at a restaurant with a 3-year waiting list, and once located a specific vintage of wine that only 11 bottles have existed anywhere in the world. He was exceptionally good at finding things. But sitting in the back of an SUV at 4 a.m. outside Darby, Montana, reading what had just pulled together on Coal Rivers, Marcus felt something he rarely felt in his professional life. He felt ashamed of his own efficiency. The file was not long. That was the first thing. Most people Richard asked him to research had digital footprints that stretched for pages. Social profiles, business registrations, property portfolios, news mentions. Coal Rivers had almost none of that. A property tax record. A single hunting license renewed every year, without exception. A marriage certificate from 11 years ago. A death certificate from 2 years ago. One medical record from a county hospital. A short clinical notation about a pregnancy loss at 22 weeks that used language so clean and professional it barely contained the weight of what it was describing. That was Coal Rivers on paper. A man the world had recorded only in losses. Marcus sat with the folder on his lap for several minutes before walking into the lodge, where Richard had finally taken a room after Lily was checked over by the medic and declared healthy and put to bed. Richard was standing at the window when Marcus entered, still in the same suit. "Jacket off now," shirt untucked for first time Marcus could remember seeing in 9 years of working alongside him. He was holding a glass of water he had not drunk from. The mountains outside the window were beginning to show their outline against the sky, shifting from black to deep purple. Marcus set the folder on the table. "Everything I could find," he said. Richard did not move immediately. Then he crossed the room and picked it up. He read it standing. Marcus watched his face and saw the precise moments each piece of information landed. The property tax debt, a slight tightening around the eyes. The November 1st auction date. Richard's jaw shifted once to the left. A tell Marcus had learned to read over years of watching him absorb bad news in boardrooms. The marriage certificate. His expression softened by a degree that was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The death certificate from Margaret and Rivers, age 34. Richard stopped reading for several seconds and looked at the middle distance before returning to the page. When he reached the medical notation about the pregnancy, he closed the folder. He stood very still. Outside, the first thin line of actual dawn was appearing over the eastern ridge, pale gold pressing up against the dark blue, like something trying to get through a door that was only just beginning to open. Richard set the folder down on the table with the particular care of someone handling something fragile. He picked up his water glass, and this time he drank from it. Then he set it down and turned to face Marcus. "The property tax," he said. "All of it. Paid in full. Today." Marcus nodded and wrote it down. "Anonymous," Richard said. "No name. No company. Nothing traceable." Marcus nodded again. Richard turned back to the window. The gold line on the horizon was wider now. "He lost a wife," he said. Not to Marcus exactly, more to glass and the mountains beyond it. "He lost a child he never got to meet. He is about to lose the land his grandfather built a home on. And last night, he walked 7 miles in the dark, carrying my daughter, and when I offered him anything he wanted, he told me she was not mine to sell back to me." He paused. "That man has more of something than I have ever had. I do not have a word for what it is." Marcus did not offer one. It was not his place, and he understood that. "One more thing," Richard said. "The cabin roof. I want it fixed. Properly. Best materials available. Local contractors only. People from his town. Cash job. No permits that would flag it. Done while he is out. And I do not want him to know." Marcus looked up from his notepad. In 9 years, he had never questioned a directive. He did not question this one. But he did allow himself a single small nod that meant something slightly beyond professional acknowledgement. He left Richard alone at the window. 3 days later, Cole Rivers came home from a morning check of his trap line to find a plain envelope tucked under his front door. No stamp. No return address. His name was not on it. Just a single line written in plain block letters on the front that said, "For the man in the trees." He stood on his porch and held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, and behind it, a document he recognized immediately. The county tax notice, the one with November 1st circled in red, now stamped across his face in blue ink with 2 words, "Paid." Cleared. He unfolded the sheet of paper. 4 words in the same plain block lettering. "The forest paid you back." Cole sat down on the top porch step. The morning was cold and clear, and a hawk was working a slow circle above the far tree line, reading the ground below with patient expertise. Cole watched it and held the paper in both hands and did not move for a long time. The weight that had lived in his chest for 2 years, layered, dense, the accumulated pressure of grief and debt, and the particular exhaustion of a man fighting alone, shifted, not disappeared, shifted the way a stone shifts in a current, still present but no longer fixed. He thought about Lily's voice in the dark. "I knew someone would come. I asked the forest." He thought about Margaret, the way she used to sit on the same step in the early mornings with her coffee held in both hands, watching exactly this kind of hawk work, exactly this kind of sky. She had loved mornings more than any other part of the day. She said they felt like permission. Cole folded the paper carefully along its original crease. He stood and went inside. He walked down the short hallway to the pale yellow room. He set the folded paper beside the wooden rabbit on the windowsill. Then he stood in the doorway of that room for the first time in 2 years, without feeling like the walls were pressing inward. The morning light came through the window and fell across the rabbit in the paper and the pale yellow walls and made them look, briefly, like something that had been waiting a long time to simply be seen. Cole went and put the kettle on. Richard Vail flew back to Chicago the following morning with Lily asleep across the seat beside him, her head on his folded jacket, the pine cone from the forest sitting on the tray table between them. He had tried twice to move it, and both times stopped himself. He did not fully understand why. He left it there for the entire flight. He did not open his laptop once. This was not something Marcus noted in any official record, but he thought about it for a long time afterward. In 9 years of travel with Richard Vail, domestic or international, short flight or long, the laptop opened within 4 minutes of reaching cruising altitude. Every single time. It was as reliable as the seatbelt sign. On this particular morning, it stayed in the bag beneath the seat, and Richard sat with his arm resting lightly on the edge of Lily's seat and watched the clouds below the window, and appeared to be doing nothing at all. Marcus had worked with enough powerful people to understand that doing nothing at all is sometimes the most significant thing a person can do. Back in Derby, the local contractors arrived at Cole's property on a Tuesday while he was 3 miles deep in the forest checking the northern line. There were 4 of them. Men Cole had seen at the hardware store and the gas station over the years. The kind of people who nod when they pass you and mean it. They had materials in the truck bed, good timber, proper flashing, insulation that actually met code. The job that would have cost $11,000 at full rate had been paid in full by someone whose name the contractor had been asked not to share. He had shrugged and taken the work. Jobs like this did not come often in Derby in September. They finished in 2 days. They replaced the 2 leaking sections, reinforced a ridge beam that had been quietly weakening for 3 winters, and resealed every joint along the north face where the mountain wind hit hardest. They cleaned up completely before leaving. No business cards. No invoice copies left behind. Just a roof that would hold through whatever the coming winter decided to bring. When Cole came home the second evening and stood in his yard looking up, he was quiet for a long time. He ran his hand along the new timber at the eave edge and looked at the clean, straight line of it against the sky. Then he went inside and stood in the main room and listened. The particular low moan the roof made when wind pushed over from the north, a sound he had lived with so long he had stopped hearing it as a problem and started hearing it as just a house talking, was gone. The room was simply quiet. He sat at his kitchen table in that quiet and felt it settle around him like something that had been missing for a long time without him fully admitting it. He did not know who had done it. He did not try to find out. Some things are received best without investigation, accepted the way rain is accepted, not understood exactly, not controlled, but stood with your face upturned, taking what is given. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at the county records office formally withdrawing the tax lien on the river's property. The land was clear. The November 1st date passed without ceremony. Cole spent that morning the way he spent most mornings, out before dawn, moving to the forest he had grown up in and nearly lost, his boots reading the ground, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was not a man given to declarations or conclusions. He did not stand on a ridge and decide something meaningful about his life. He simply walked the way he always walked and noticed, somewhere around the 2nd mile, that he was not carrying the same weight he had been carrying for 2 years. It was not completely gone. Grief does not go, but it had changed texture. It had gone from something that pressed down to something that simply walked alongside, present but no longer crushing, a companion rather than a captor. He thought about Lily once, the memory of her voice rising clean and small from the base of that fallen oak in the dark, talking to a pine cone like it was the most natural thing in the world. He thought about her father on his knees in the wet grass, holding her with the specific desperation of someone who has just understood what they almost lost. He thought about how a man with more money than Cole would ever see in 10 lifetimes had been completely powerless in the dark and cold, and how that powerlessness had cracked something open in him that all his success had sealed shut. Cole did not feel superior about this. He felt something quieter than that, something closer to recognition. The understanding that every person, regardless of what they own or control or command, arrives at some point in their life at the edge of a dark forest with no map and no leverage and nothing left but the hope that something good is moving through the trees toward them. Some people wait their whole lives for that something. Cole had simply been nearby. He stopped at the top of a familiar ridge and looked out over the valley below. The trees ran in every direction, dense and dark and alive. The same forest his grandfather had walked, the same land his own feet had memorized over 38 years of quiet living. The morning sun was breaking over the eastern peaks now, throwing long gold light across the canopy, turning the frost on the high branches into brief fire before it melted and was gone. He stood there for a while, just breathing, just present. Then he turned and walked home. Some men measure their worth in what they accumulate. Cole Rivers had $11, a clear piece of land, a repaired roof, and a yellow room with a wooden rabbit on the windowsill. He had walked 7 miles through a dark forest, carrying someone else's child, and asked for nothing in return. And in doing so, he had given a powerful man something no amount of money had ever purchased for him. The knowledge that goodness still moves through the dark, unhurried and unnamed, finding what is lost and bringing it home. Not every rich man deserves to be humbled, but every humble man deserves to be seen. Cole Rivers was seen, and that quietly was enough. If this story moves something in you, share it with one person tonight. Not because we asked, because some stories deserve to travel further than the place they started. Subscribe for more stories about the people the world walks past. They are always worth stopping for.